So the first topic we'll look at is what's called the mind-body problem, or you could think of it as what is the relationship between mental states and the physical world. I've put here a picture of René Descartes, who sort of kicked off the detailed discussion of this problem within the Western philosophical tradition. But this is an issue that goes way back. So you can find roughly 500 BC people in India and maybe a little bit later Greece, taking almost all of the positions that we now have, materialism, dualism, and so on. These debates go back as far as we have a recorded history of debate. And I bet it goes back as soon as there were human beings wondering about what is their place in the universe, which is probably as soon as there were human beings. So the issue is this. On the one hand, there are things like tables, and I take it that tables don't think or have experiences or have feelings. I put computers in that category as well, and cameras and things. On the other hand, there are creatures like you and me, and we have consciousness in the sense we have experience. We feel things. It's something is like to be us, is one way of putting it. But if there's physical stuff that doesn't think, and there's us who do have experiences and do think, how do you relate the two? I mean, you might say, well, it's the brain that does the thinking. Neurons fire and they do things in the right way. Well, it's certainly part of the answer. Neurons have something to do with it. But how do you get from neurons to consciousness, to feelings? So this computer here is doing all sorts of complicated things, but I take it this computer doesn't experience the world. It doesn't have feelings. Yeah. Well, I don't know. So there are some people called panpsychists who says no, everything has a bit of consciousness, even tables and chairs and atoms. So that's a different point of view one could have, but we could at least imagine that they don't, right? Okay. It's very possible that these things don't and computers don't. And if you think that they don't, then how do we get from, say, a brain to consciousness? So Jerry Fodor, the philosopher, put it like this: nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Nobody even knows what it would be like to have the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. So that's sort of the issue I'd like to discuss. That same idea has been put another way with the phrase explanatory gap. On the one hand, there's physical stuff like brains. On the other hand, there's consciousness. But there just seems to be a gulf in between them that stops us going, at least going easily from one to the other. So I could take a brain, a slimy mass of sort of walnut-shaped porridge, slam it on the table and say, are you telling me that this thinks? Okay. So that's the challenge. So let's go through some possible answers. Well, the first answer is to say it's hard to go from one to the other because there are intrinsically two different substances or properties. And to say there's two of something is to be a dualist. So this position is called dualism. Descartes proposed substance dualism. In other words, there's two different sorts of substances, if you like, mind and material or physical things. Or the way of thinking about this is when the body dies, the brain ceases to function, the mind can carry on existing. You can carry on having a point of view after bodily death. That would be substance dualism, if you believe that. But you can be a dualist without being a substance dualist. you can be a property dualist. And what you say there is, I have no idea how mental properties could come into existence if all there were physical properties, if all there were voltages and electricity of neurons firing or not, and physical stuff and weight. You could never get mental properties out of that. Well, that's because mental properties are something different from physical properties. But it's just a law of the universe that when you have a physical system organized in the right way, like brains are organized, that mental properties pop into existence. You can't explain that. It's just a brute fact of the universe. Yes?
Is that called emergence?
Yes, you could call that emergence, that's right. Yeah. So property dualists, dualism often goes with emergence. But the mental property, although distinct from any physical property, it's not a voltage, it's not a weight, and so on. So it's not any physical property we know about. It is its own distinctive self, a mental property, but it does depend on the physical system being organized in a certain way. So on property dualism, when the body dies and the brain dies, that's it. The mental properties cease to exist as well. But nonetheless, they're still dualists. And one person who brought the debate back to this issue and seriously and strongly argued for property dualism was David Chalmers in his, I think his 96 book. And that's him there, Australian philosopher. I put this little drawing here because what Descartes said was, he said the mental stuff communicates with the physical stuff. And he tried to wonder, well, where would this communication happen? Well, he said the pineal gland isn't duplicated on both sides of the brain, there's just one of them. So this looks like an ideal location by which the soul or the mental stuff might communicate with the brain to pick up on perceptions and send commands back down. We can reject this hypothesis because you can remove the pineal gland and the person still talks, exists, and seems to be consciously there. So one way of dividing up dualism is whether it's substance or property. They can also divide it up in two other ways, which you can cross-classify with the first two ways. Epiphenomenalism versus interactionism. Epiphenomenalism means that there is mental stuff or mental properties, depending whether you're substance or property dualist, but it can't actually do anything. It can't causally affect the physical world. So the mental stuff sits there and is somehow affected or informed by the physical world, for example, what's happening in the brain, but it can't in turn change anything that's happening in the brain. Why might you have this funny idea? Well, it depends, I suppose, how seriously you take physics. So physics has this set of causal principles, and wherever we look, it seems physics is obeyed. And indeed, if you do experiments in quantum physics, you can make predictions to the, I don't know what it is now, but something like the 15th decimal place about what will happen. And physics, as far as we can tell, of course we can't be sure, seems to be obeyed in the brain as well. So if we have this set of causal laws, which we're pretty confident in because the best experiments we can do show them to be highly accurate as far as they have been tested. In fact, there's no experiment that falsifies quantum physics. Its predictions just seem to be stunningly confirmed, as I say, to the nth decimal place. So then, what role is there for a causal influence of spirits or consciousness or mental stuff? So some people say, David Chalmers in his original work, although he isn't so wedded to that idea now, says, well, the physical universe is causally closed, what that means is if there's a physical effect, there's a physical cause, and that's all maybe not completely explained by modern day physics, but it will be explained anyway by some future physics. But nonetheless, what happens is mental properties pop into existence at the right time that reflect the organisation, what's happening in the brain, but because the physical universe is causally closed, those properties can't themselves change anything. So you can have the experience of, say, intending to lift your arm, but really the causal process that led to my arm lifting is some event in the brain that gives a mental property of feeling like I have an intention, but it's really the physical stuff in the brain that makes the arm lift. Okay? So that's the epiphenomenalist. Now, you could be a substance dualist and an epiphenomenalist, although Descartes wasn't. He was what you call an interactionist. An interactionist says the causal influence goes both ways. So Descartes was a substance interactionist. But Popper, Karl Popper, the philosopher who we'll talk about in the philosophy of science, was a property dualist who was an interactionist. So Popper said, much like you were saying about emergent properties, that mental properties do emerge, and they have causal influences. There can be, as it were, these properties emerge, they can have top-down influences on the physical world. And this is how it seems to us, anyway, in the sense that I think arm lift. So I have the intention of lifting my arm, and there she goes. So it seems to me that the mental intention, right, caused my arm to lift. So that's an influence of a causal influence of the mental on the physical. That's how it seems to me. And Popper says, and you can take that seriously, that is a causal influence of the mental on the physical, where the mental is something intrinsically distinct from the physical, in the sense it's a certain sort of property that's not a physical property. And the causal influence can go the other way, which is when we perceive things. So when I look at those blue chairs there, there's physical stuff, the chairs, and there's wavelengths of light coming towards my eyes, and that creates firing in here, and then that causes certain mental properties, namely the feeling, the sensation of blue. So the causal influence is both way, according to the interactionist. So if you're a dualist, you could be substance or property, and independent of that, you could be epiphenomenalist or interactionist, just depending on how you try and square the various circles. So let's consider various arguments for dualism. First of all, I put here qualia. That's a sort of a technical term drawn from the Greek that philosophers of mind talk about. A qualia is the plural, quale would be the singular. The quale of seeing blue. What it is the actual experience in itself. And an experience means it's something it's like to have that experience. So in terms of the blue chairs there, I could have a blue detector. For example, in a colour camera, it goes into a different state depending on whether it's blue or it's red, right? It can detect blue. But does the camera actually have the experience of blue? Is it something like that camera, something bluish, as it were, when it detects the blue there? So let us say we're not a panpsychist and we say, no, cameras don't have experiences, they're just things. And there's nothing it's like to be that camera when it detects blue. So the camera doesn't have blue qualia. It doesn't have the experience of blue in itself. Yes, it detects blue. It has blue detectors in there. But that doesn't create any experience. Just so you might have certain neurons that detect blue. But that doesn't necessarily in itself create any experience. That's just some physical stuff responding to blue. But what we have is the experience of blue. And that's the qualia. So to have qualia means it's something is like to be you. So to put it another way, if you were somehow to become another creature, if there was something it was like to be that creature, you would in some sense carry on existing as a conscious being. But if you were suddenly to become a table or a colour camera, would that be annihilation of yourself? Right? If it has no qualia, that's it. That's the end of story. That's lights out. So qualia is sort of lights on, as it were. It's you have experiences. Just put your hands up if you think you understand what I mean by qualia. That's great. Good. So the first argument for dualism is it does seem like there are qualia, that we have experiences. And that seems somehow to be something fundamentally different than just a physical system detecting things. So how do you explain those qualia? Anyway, that's the most fundamental argument for dualism. If there's one thing you can be sure of, more than anything else, is you have experience. Maybe you could argue you can be even more sure of that than the physical world exists. Now, another sort of argument you might make for dualism, or it's a weaker argument, is from parapsychology. So parapsychology is the investigation of telepathy, psychokinesis. In other words, things that shouldn't happen if all there was the physical universe, at least as we understand it now. So if you had, I don't know, some identical twins, one in one room, one in another room, and you try and cut off all normal forms of communication, and when one looks at horrific videos, the other sweats more or something like this, and you say there's some connection between them that goes above and beyond any physical means of communication that we know about. In other words, there's telepathy. If you got good evidence for that, would you say now there is evidence for dualism? So whether or not you take this as evidence of dualism depends on whether or not you believe there is evidence for parapsychology, which is very much disputed. So I leave that up to you to assess whether there is such evidence, and there's groups of people who investigate these things, and therefore whether you could take that to be evidence for dualism. But just say there's another counter-argument that even if you accepted the evidence that such phenomena existed, some people argue, but that doesn't show that there's anything more than physics. It's just there's some tweaks to physics we need to add, like maybe brains are special sort of quantum devices, and there's some little tweaks in the laws of physics we need to understand for how the special physics of the brain can sort of resonate with other brains. So there might be a perfectly good physical explanation for parapsychology. Now here's another argument that goes back a fair way and was Karl Popper's main argument for dualism. Now, you probably believe that you believe things for reasons. Right? In other words, if I said to you, why do you believe that, you would give me some reasons for believing that. And if those reasons are undermined, you might say anyway, well, I'll change my mind and I'll believe something else. But let's say your beliefs were only due to the physical nature of your brain. So you didn't believe in things for reasons, you believed in things because your neurons fired a certain way. Well, the argument is that if you're therefore a materialist or a physicalist and say there's only brains and physical stuff happening, then your beliefs are simply based on the physics of your brain and not on reasons for believing things. But that means you have no reason to believe in your materialism. So if you've got no good reasons to believe in your materialism, would you kindly give it up? This is the argument, and we'll return to that later. And the key question here is, could a physical system produce conclusions for good reasons? So we'll return to that. Now the arguments against dualism. The first argument is really an argument against substance dualism. And it's the neural dependence of all known mental phenomena. Now take any mental state, any mental phenomenon you please. We can change that mental state by changing physical stuff, particularly the brain. And you all know that whenever you go to Falmouth Bar, have a few beers, and then the way you think changes. And the important thing about this argument is it's not just something like perception changes, because according to Descartes, what you perceive does depend on your sensory apparatus and the brain doing certain things. So of course, to the substance dualist, if you change the brain, you're going to change how things look to you, perception. But the point is, you can take aspects of a person's nature or mental life that we take to be core to what it is to be that person. So, for example, their moral character. How impulsive are they? So, the famous case of Phineas Gage, who was an upstanding member of the community in the late 1800s, and he worked on the railway line. There was an explosion, and a rod went through his frontal lobes. And afterwards, they say he was just a different person. He couldn't hold down a job. He gambled his money away. His relationships broke up because he was so impulsive. And so his very nature as a moral, spiritual being had changed. So name anything you please about a person's nature that you say is fundamental to the self, to the soul, and there will be a way of monkeying with it by giving damage to a particular bit of the brain, giving drugs, and so on. So it seems like there's nothing about your mental life that we can't change by changing the physiology, biochemistry, by changing the physical stuff. So what is there left for a soul substance to do if that's the case? Second argument is explanatory power. So ideas in science are respected when they help generate testable theories that withstand testing. But there aren't any sort of dualist-inspired theories of the human mind and psychology. Let alone any dualist-inspired theories that have withstood thorough testing. It seems like we could just get rid of the soul stuff and we can get on with the science of the mind just as well. Now, the third argument is evolution. So human beings came into existence gradually as you go back, and there's lots of research happening now of sort of more and more different types of Homo species that have been around. And even if you don't relate, if you say it's not just humans that are conscious, say monkeys and mammals and your dog, maybe rats, there's this gradual change, right, of life as it evolved. But this gradual change is brought about by evolution. And evolution is just physical processes happening and being selected for, and so certain physical states being more likely to be replicated in the next generation. So how does this physical process lead to something non-physical happening? Well, that's been used as an argument against dualism, although Popper twists it the other way round and uses it as an argument for dualist interactionism, because he says we know that there are conscious states. Now, these conscious states to evolve must have been causal. So it's just a fact of the universe, as it were, that when you get certain levels of complexity, you do get conscious states emerge. And they can't have been epiphenomenal, otherwise they never would have been selected for and evolved, so they must have been causal. Well, dualism is one way to go. But if you didn't want to be a dualist, the simplest thing to be is a monist. And a monist says there's only one thing, type of thing. And if you're going to be monist about the mind-body problem, you can be monist in two ways. The first way is to say only the mind exists, and that's idealism. A person you sort of know is Carl Pearson. Well, you know him because of the Pearson correlation coefficient. He was a statistician. He wrote a book which was famous in the 19th century about the nature of science, and he was an idealist. He thought only mind existed. In fact, idealism was, 100 years ago, the most dominant position on this topic, and all completely turned around after that. You don't really get many idealists these days, but it was dominant 100 years ago. Here's an argument for why you might believe it by Sir James Jeans, Cambridge astrophysicist. So he was a mathematician and a physicist, and what was startling to him, and indeed is startling, and indeed is a bit of a mystery, that mathematics is developed by the human mind just sitting down and thinking. In fact, a lot of pure mathematics that mathematicians come up with, it doesn't seem to have any application to the world whatsoever. It later turns out to be immensely applicable and to solve all sorts of problems. But the mathematics came about just by thinking about it. Just by thinking, we come out with these equations and structures that seem to describe the world and account for the world in incredible detail. As I said, quantum physics, which essentially is mathematical, can describe the world to the 15th decimal place. That seems just uncanny. I mean, why should it be like that? Why should mathematics be just so good at explaining the world? So Sir James Jeans said, well, maybe that's because the world isn't something separate from our thinking. Our thinking came out with mathematics. Maybe the world is a great thought itself. And then it's no longer mysterious that thinking should account for it. So it's a great thought in maybe the mind of a great thinker. Yes?
Is that some kind of simulation argument? Like, say, I don't know.
Yeah, it's sort of similar to simulation arguments, although...
Too far-fetched.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that.
Yes. Yes, that's sort of a good analogy. It's not quite Matrix style in the sense there's a real world in a simulation. All there is just the simulation, just thought. That's right. And incidentally, so that's the motivation, that was Sir James Jeans's motivation for idealism. That issue of how good mathematics is still a live one that people come back to and just shake their heads at. But as I say, that isn't such a popular position these days. The more popular position is physicalism. Well, it used to be called materialism, but not even physicists believe that only matter exists. There's more to the physical world than matter, so materialism is a bit of an outdated term, so we say physicalism, which means what you probably would think materialism means. It's just the physical world exists. Whatever it is that physics says is out there, including sort of fields and energy, time and space and so on, that is what exists and there's nothing else. So the argument here is when you look at the way physical stuff works, that's when we seem to understand the mind. Do you understand when you understand how we see colours in the colour space? Well, look at the photoreceptors in our eyes. Look at the wavelengths of light that they respond to. Look how different patterns of wavelengths trigger their firing. And that seems to exactly match how we experience colour. So mental states are just brain states by another name. We just came up with different words to explain the same thing. And you might say, really, just different words? They seem so different. And the physicists could say, well, yes, but lightning doesn't seem like electric discharge in any obvious way. I mean, we know it is now, but we had to do experiments to find that out. And now we know that lightning is identical to electric discharge. Okay? Just means electric discharge coming from the clouds downwards. Electric discharge in a certain physical situation. It's not as if there's anything additional to lightning than the electric discharge in a certain situation. That is all it is. It's identical to that. But it's something we had to find out. It wasn't obvious to us as a thought experiment or something. You have to do the hard work, empirical investigation to find it out. And likewise, sadness is just a certain sort of brain state. I know it's not obvious to us, but you know, if you poke around in the brain and monkey with it and stuff and understand how it works, you'll see sadness is just a sort of brain state. So that's what the physicalist says. And with all these positions, there's always sort of subtle differences. I mean, one way of being a monist and sort of a physicalist is to say, and physical matter, we experience it from the inside. So maybe there's a little bit, there only is physical matter, but it is has properties, or it, I don't want to drift into property dualism here, but somehow there's an inner view of matter that isn't perhaps quite recognized in the physics equations, but all there is matter anyway, or physical stuff that we are constituted by. For now, I want to go on to what is probably the most common philosophical position amongst cognitive scientists, but which include psychologists as well. And they argued against identifying mental states, certain sorts of mental states with certain sorts of brain states in the following way. Well, if mental states are brain state, what about robots and aliens? They don't have brains. So are you telling me that they cannot have mental states? Sitting in your armchair, you've decided mental states are brain states. Can we rule out, without even looking, without doing any observations or experiments, that alien up there, which has a silicon-based physiology, or that robot, very intricate, also made out of silicon, cannot have conscious experience just by sitting in your armchair? So the functionalist says, no, that's silly. We can't just sit in our armchair and declare aliens have no mental state. So maybe, for example, that would justify annihilating their civilization so we can take over their planet. Or pull the plug out on the robot. So functionalists, in a way, are sort of physicalists in that they say the stuff that exists is just physical stuff. The physical stuff can work in all sorts of different ways. And if you take a computer, while all that there exists in computers is physical stuff, what's very useful to distinguish is the hardware from the software. And the same software can run with different hardware. And the software is how it works. So as long as it works in the same way, it might seem like Word, but underneath it all, the electronics by which that happens could be completely different. Every 10 years that could change dramatically. But as long as you click on here and this happens, and then if you click on there, that happens, it's still Word. It's still the same program. Just so, mental states are sort of like a type of software that runs on the hardware of the brain as it happens, but as long as the same software was running on something else, maybe a robot or an alien, it still would be the same mental state. So what makes something software? Well, it means when you have the same sort of input, you get the same output. That's the functional relationship we're talking about here. So to be angry means to perceive an injustice that motivates you to want to take revenge. Well, you don't have to have a brain to run that particular set of input-output relationships. It could be silicon. Then, of course, you have to say what is injustice and what is revenge. But again, we just define a set of relationships, and as long as we have all these relationships in place, we have the same software, then we have the same mental states, the same mind. Okay? So that's functionalism. It's how things function that matters. To be happy is just to function in a certain way. Now, this is interesting in terms of undermining one of the main arguments for dualism, because what you find when you have software running on hardware is a computer can come to conclusions for good reasons, because that's what the software gives you. So that means you could be a physicalist and still have good reasons for believing in your physicalism, even though all that exists is physical stuff. So that probably is that would be the common reaction to this argument, but there are people out there like John Searle who undermines this counter-argument. Okay? So if you want to know more about that, read up John Searle. And incidentally, I should just preface everything I'm talking to you about today. I'm not giving you settled arguments one way or the other. So any of the arguments or counter-arguments I give you, there will be further ways of thinking about that, which I haven't mentioned, and many that I don't even know. So what are the arguments against functionalism? One is the inverted spectrum. So here is my little boy Tenzin when he was younger. He might look at the yellow teddy and say the teddy is yellow. So he functions in the right way, calling lemons yellow and teddy yellow, and so on. And then when he sees tomatoes, he says red. So the functioning is all there, and it could be the same as me, and so on. But how do I know that the qualia he's having, the actual raw experience isn't his yellow qualia is like my red one? In other words, when I look at that and I have this experience of blueness, I say blue, that might correspond to your experience of redness. We function in the same way, so we'd never know. And the argument goes, as long as you can conceive of that as a possibility, there must be something wrong with functionalism. Now, John Searle's famous argument against functionalism is a Chinese room argument. If understanding something just is to function in the right way, then what about this, he says? Just put me in a room with a great big book. What you can do is post in some cards, which are Chinese symbols, like we say, ni hao ma. He'll then look in his book about what he's meant to do. Okay, in this situation, here's a set of if-then rules. Okay, if I get these symbols in this context, what should I do? I should post those symbols. How? But he doesn't understand Chinese, hasn't the faintest idea about the Chinese language. He just looks up things in the big book, has the right functional relationship, but he doesn't have any understanding of Chinese. So John Searle uses this as an argument against functionalism because he wants to say that understanding goes above and beyond simple functional relationships. Now that generated a large debate, as do all of these arguments. And again, I'll just say, don't take anything I say as settled or conclusive, but follow up any arguments you find interesting yourself. So that lays out the main positions and some of the main arguments. I don't know if you have any feelings about this, but just out of interest, who here would count themselves, and let me just say, philosophers have not settled what the right answer is on this topic. So you're completely free to go in different directions. You're not wrong if you hold a certain position, right? So who here would think of themselves as a dualist if you have a settled opinion on the matter? Just put your hands up if you feel more dualist inclined. All right, good. How about idealist? Only mind exists? There's a few idealists there. And physicalists. Anybody physicalist? All right, so we do get a spread of opinion on this, and that's great. Okay, thanks very much, and we're going to talk about flourishing in the next lecture.